You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for speaking with me today. We're recording this interview on Thursday, January 16th, 2025, less than 24 hours since the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was agreed to after 467 days of war. I'm joined now by a former ISM volunteer and friend, Avaishinur Egi, the 26-year-old Turkish-American woman who was also an ISM volunteer who was shot and killed by the IDF while accompanying Palestinians in the West Bank on September 6, 2024. ISM stands for International Solidarity Movement, and we'll talk about that and what ISM does in just a moment. But for now, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm doing all right.
I want to ask you about how you're feeling about the ceasefire that was just announced later on in our talk, but just to make sure that listeners understand, could you explain what exactly ISM is and what it does? I think a lot of people who listen to the show have probably heard of them before, but just to clarify.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, it stands for International Solidarity Movement. It was founded in 2001, in my understanding, by a small group brought together some anti-Zionist Israeli activists, some Palestinian activists, and some international activists. They kind of operate along four principles. One, that they're Palestinian-led. They're committed to nonviolence as a strategy, not necessarily an ideology, but as a strategy. They make decisions using consensus, and they use an anti-oppression lens, which includes being explicitly anti-Zionist. And I think their origin is connected to the Palestinian Popular Committees that arose during the First and Second Intifadas. And their goal is to participate and support the popular resistance. And so they do this through a variety of activities, being part of and showing up at public demonstrations and actions, but also a big part of what they do is what they call protective presence, which looks like having international volunteers accompany Palestinians in their daily lives in the hopes that an international presence will lessen or decrease the amount of violence that the Palestinians face from both Israeli settlers and military. So concretely, that would look like accompanying sheep herders in the fields, or farmers harvesting their crops, or accompanying school children on their way to school, being present at homes that are threatened with demolition, stuff like that.
Gotcha. So what does it mean to be involved in the popular resistance in Palestine? What is that? I mean, you just talked about a little bit of what that looks like in the day-to-day, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about ISM's relationship to different government entities and to armed groups.
Yeah. So I should clarify that I volunteered with ISM and I went to do this work, but I actually didn't do it on the ground because of the murder of my friend so early on in our time there. And so I can't speak in depth about what it looks like in practice, but from my understanding, being involved and supporting the popular resistance, I believe means not having any direct relationship with any specific political entity. So the organization doesn't take a position for or against any of the political parties or groups. I imagine that there's a range of political opinions amongst volunteers, but as an organization, there's no formal relationship with the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or anything. The relationship with the Israeli government is very contentious, obviously, as a explicitly anti-Zionist organization that's going to bring the group in conflict with Israel. And there have been multiple sort of smear campaigns over the course of the ISM's existence, in which like Israeli politicians or other like Zionist media figures will try to claim that ISM is involved in quote unquote terrorist activities. But there's, well, for one, there's no basis to these claims. And then also, like, I think most of us are well aware that the state, whether it's Israel or the US or other states, will use labels such as terrorist or whatever as a form of repression if they want to try to publicly discredit any form of resistance or liberation. So it's a meaningless accusation, but it has been made.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, I know we've spoken off the record before, so I've gotten a little bit more context about you, but I'm wondering if you could share why you decided to work with ISM, because I think you had kind of unique reasons for joining. And then I'm also wondering if we could talk a little bit more about this question of the difference between nonviolence as a strategy versus an ideology, and how that kind of ties into your decision to work with ISM.
Yeah, I think, I don't know about what the majority of other ISM volunteers' thought processes are like when they are considering joining. But for me, I didn't decide to go to the West Bank with ISM because I thought that I personally was going to make any difference in the broader, like, brutal colonial dynamic. And I wasn't convinced that internationals doing protective presence was going to change much about the situation either. For me, it was more specifically an opportunity to expose myself to really dangerous conditions, life or death situations, in the hopes that that experience would be useful in the future and would give me more courage to act in more substantial types of solidarity in the future. Yeah, I could say more. I don't know if you wanted me to say more about the protective presence.
Yeah, I would be curious about that. I think just to back up a little bit for people that maybe aren't familiar, I mean, the idea is basically that having foreigners there somehow diminishes. Is that the idea, that having foreigners alongside Palestinians in their resistance is going to slightly diminish the likelihood that they will be attacked or that they will be killed?
Yeah, I think that's the logic behind it.
Mm-hmm. And that's why they call it a protective presence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that?
I think I have sort of complicated views on it. I'm not exactly sure what I think. The phrase itself is a little uncomfortable to me because I think it reveals that there's an acceptance of this like inherent difference between internationals and Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that in the long run, if that's like emphasizing or accepting that difference is a long-term strategy for liberation.
Mm.
It kind of calls into question what solidarity means in my mind. So I think like the underlying assumption of that strategy is that at some point, by mobilizing the racial or national privileges of international volunteers, the ruling class and the governments of the United States and other world powers will suddenly be convinced that they need to stop funding like ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And this could be the case, but it seems unlikely. Like that hasn't happened. That hasn't worked. I don't know if there's some like threshold of amount of like international exposure or like some level of outcry that's going to result because internationals are exposed to the violence of the Israeli state. I don't know. I think that is sort of foundational to the idea of protective presence. And so I think maybe not purposefully, but incidentally, this also accepts the premise that the lives of Americans or other internationals are fundamentally more valuable than and completely separate from Palestinian lives. And again, I think that this is probably true in the eyes of the Israeli government and military. But like I said, it seemed to undermine the concept of solidarity to me. Like if we're truly in solidarity with people, whether they're in Palestine or anywhere, don't we have to see ourselves as no different than them? Like, it doesn't seem like there can be a tiered struggle in which Palestinians risk their lives as insurgents and internationals only risk their social reputations for, and the extent of solidarity is simply like supporting or observing the insurgents from a distance rather than participating as an equal. So it seems like until large numbers of internationals are willing to see themselves as 100% invested in the struggle, then the Palestinian rebels will still effectively be on their own.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because in some ways, that's how some people sort of think of the decision to travel to Palestine and to do accompaniment there. But you're drawing this distinction between accompaniment and maybe insurrection.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Mm-hmm. So you went to Palestine with Ayşenur, and if you think you can speak on it, do you know what motivated her? Can you tell us a little bit about who Ayşenur was, both personally and politically, and in any sense?
Yeah. Since her murder, there's been a number of tributes that have come out about her written by people who knew her maybe even more so than I did, or in different ways or at different points in her life. And so I think all of those are worth reading. For me, like, I met her about 4 years ago, or 4 years prior to her death, and through her partner, who was my friend. And prior to that, I've since learned that she had quite an active political life before I met her. And this is when she was pretty young, like high school and just after high school. I know that she traveled to Standing Rock and was involved in that movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline and involved in other political movements. And then, but I kind of knew her in the first 3 years of our friendship in more just like through just a purely friend way. Like, we had a similar friend group and we would hang out in groups of people and stuff like that. But after October 7th, I think both of us kind of got re-engaged in Palestine solidarity work, and that sort of helped us build a new dynamic in our friendship that was more based around political activity. And so, some things that she did in the year prior to us traveling to the West Bank that are really notable is she organized like a grassroots fundraiser for people in Gaza, and she did it seemingly all on her own in a very short period of time, and was able to raise something like $40,000 or $50,000 in just a matter of hours.
Wow.
It was like 10 or 20 times the amount that she expected to raise. And so she was this very tenacious organizer when she set her mind to something, and it was pretty admirable. And then she was quite involved in organizing student encampment at the University of Washington, where she was a student at that last spring. And, again, she worked tirelessly, and through that experience, sort of like strategizing and reflecting on the days spent there with her, kind of deepened our political relationship. It's my view, and I'm not positive about this, but I think that it was sort of a disappointment of the end of the encampment at the University of Washington that led her to search for a different sort of activity around Palestine. And I think that that's, in my mind, that's when she approached me as saying, I think I'm going to go physically be in Palestine. I want to volunteer with an organization. We had previously talked about going to volunteer with ISM, but neither of us had really committed to it. But it was like in the aftermath of this sort of deterioration of the UW encampment that I think she felt more certain. And so her certainty is what motivated me to take that step. And so from there, we planned the trip.
Wow. And so how long did it take to plan that trip, and what exactly were the steps entailed, and what were what did you do? Where did you go? And what was the situation on the ground when you arrived there with Aishenur?
there's several rounds of when you contact the ISM as an organization expressing your interest, they kind of do a vetting process. And then there's a couple online informational and training sessions before you actually travel there. So, I guess I had first attended an in-person info session about the ISM back in December of 23. But I think after Aishenur and I decided that we were going to go, the planning took, I don't know, maybe three or 4 months, something like that. So I think it was in large part off the international radar, the West Bank, because of the genocide going on in Gaza since October of 2023. But the reality in the West Bank was also very brutal and had been getting more and more deadly over the course of that year. Forget the exact number of Palestinians in the West Bank who'd been killed over the course of that year, but it was in the upper hundreds, maybe even over 1,000. I can't remember, but it was always bad, and it had been significantly worse over the past year. And then, so in the West Bank, there's this very complicated system of governance that is all, essentially what it all boils down to is Israeli occupation and control, but they call it different things in different areas. So there's areas A, B, and C, and maybe listeners know about this, but I'm certainly no expert. It's quite complicated. But Area A, from my understanding, these are all the result of the Oslo Accords from 93, 94. Area A is supposed to be controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area B is shared control between Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military. And then Area C is exclusively controlled by the Israeli military. Now, in effect, the Israeli military can do whatever it wants in any of those areas, but their presence is less frequent in Area A and to an extent Area B. Area C are often the areas that are actively being settled and annexed by Israelis with the help of the Israeli government. So some of the larger cities in the West Bank are primarily in Area A. So, for example, Ramallah, which is where we're kind of based, and Nablus, which is another major city. But just outside of Nablus is a town or a village called Beta, and it's mixed, the land that it sits on is mixed between Area B and Area C, and has a settler outpost that's been being constructed and going on it since 2020 or 2021. And so this is one of many places in the West Bank that are very tense and tightly contested. And so that was part of what we arrived at. And I would say prior to our arriving, for the month or two, or even the weeks leading up to our arrival, there had been an increasing number of attacks on both Palestinians in the West Bank and international volunteers. And these were coming both from Israeli soldiers, but also settlers, who were sometimes referred to as settler soldiers. And basically they were putting people in the hospital with violent attacks, broken bones, pretty severe injuries, and with complete impunity. There was never anything done as a punishment or deterrent for these types of actions. And then, in addition to that, less than a month prior to our arrival in the West Bank, another ISM volunteer who's been in the news and stuff, named Daniel Santiago, he had been shot in his leg by Israeli forces in this village of Beta, which I mentioned, at the same weekly demonstration where Aishenur would be murdered on the 6th of September. And again, similar to the other attacks, nothing was done in response to the shooting either by the U.S. or Israeli governments.
Wow. And so what was this demo? You said it was a weekly demo or a monthly demo. How long had it been going on for?
Yeah, it's a weekly, every Friday demonstration, mostly a symbolic demonstration. The residents of Beta have been doing it. I'm worried that I might get this wrong, but at least I mean, I think it's since the formation of the settler outpost on the land nearby. And so for roughly 4 years, but I think that Beta, even before that, has been a place of Israeli incursion and violence for decades, and also like regular resistance to that. So it's a pretty storied place. So every Friday, the townspeople, they hold Friday prayers in the middle of the day in this outdoor space at the top of a hill, and then they start a demonstration chanting in protest of this Israeli settler outpost that's on the adjacent hill. And the Israeli military comes and is present for every demonstration, and they repress it very severely. As soon as it starts, as soon as people start chanting, they start shooting tear gas and often and increasingly shooting live ammunition at protesters. So that's the context of the demonstrations in Beta.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the initial steps once you all arrived in Palestine. What was it like? Where did you go? And yeah, what was the time sort of leading up to Aishiner's killing like for the two of you and for other people that you were with?
So there's 2 days of on the ground training in Ramallah, and even the morning of the first day of training, there was a report of a group of international volunteers who were attacked, and some of them were sent to the hospital, attacked by settlers. So we had these 2 days of training, and then the next day was Friday, and we were planning to go, like often ISM volunteers attend these demonstrations in Beta. It's not a requirement, but it's an option. And Aishenur and I were planning to attend, but then I became ill, and so she decided to go without me. And should I get into her murder, the details of it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that next, and I know that you have kept a journal, and so if you would like to share from that, I know it would be really helpful to hear your reflections on that experience, but maybe you also want to share a little bit before going into the journal as well.
Yeah. So I'll just say, I mean, I think the story's been reported pretty widely. A lot of people may know the details, but she attended this demonstration just like others. As soon as it started, the Israeli soldiers shot tear gas and live ammunition. And Beta is on this very steep hill. And so what happens is that protesters pretty quickly retreat down the hill and sometimes into some olive groves in the village. And so Aishenur did that. And there was a period from witness accounts, like I said, I wasn't physically there, but from witness accounts, there was like this period of retreat, a period of calm where it seemed like the whole thing may be wrapping up. People say anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, nothing was really going on, no skirmishes or conflicts. But what some of the Israeli soldiers do, I think regularly, and they did on this day, is they take over Palestinian homes to use as like surveillance points and points from which to shoot from. And so a group of them took over this rooftop at the top of the hill of a Palestinian home, and where they had like a clear view all the way down the hill. And so it's reported that Aishenur and any of the other people who had retreated were over 200 yards, up to 230 yards away from where these soldiers were standing on the rooftop. And then suddenly, in the midst of what seemed like the end of the demonstration, two shots of live ammunition rang out. One of them struck something metal, either a pole or a dumpster or something, and ricocheted and hit a Palestinian young person in his leg. And then the other one was a direct shot into Aishinur's head. She was standing next to an olive tree in an olive grove, and people tried to stop the bleeding, and she was put in an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, but died very shortly after reaching the hospital in Nablus.
Mm. So I'm wondering if you want to share about how you found out, and then maybe also some pieces from your journal, if you, or maybe providing some context around that as well. Like, were you keeping a journal at the time, or is this stuff that you wrote afterwards?
Yeah. So my journal was kind of in the form of somewhat regular reports to a group of friends on a messaging app. So people who were friends of mine who I asked, before I left if they wanted to receive updates from me were on a list, and then I would kind of send things as I could. And so I guess I found out that she had been shot via text message from other ISM people who were at the scene. I was in Ramallah, and I just was kind of in shock for quite a while, and then fairly soon it was reported that she had died.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I guess I'll read some of what I wrote that day, because I guess it kind of captures what I was thinking and feeling at that time.
Thanks.
So September 6, 2024. I don't know how to say this. There's no easy way. I wish I could write something eloquent, but I can't through my sobbing tears. Ayşenur, my friend, comrade, and travel partner to Palestine, was just shot in the head and murdered by the Israeli occupation forces. May she rest in power. She is now one of many martyrs in this struggle. I'm just sitting here all day, tears welling intermittently. Don't know what to do. So many regrets. Wish it would have been me and not her. I am much older than her, and she had so many things she wanted to do with her life. I was the one who came more prepared to die here. I knew the risks. I wrote a will before I came. I don't think she really considered that much of a possibility. I should have discouraged her from going to the demo. I was asked not to go to it today because I have COVID, so I stayed in Ramallah. I should have asked her to wait another week for when we could go together. Instead, when she asked me if I was in her shoes, would I go alone, I said I would. This morning, I gave her some supplies to deal with tear gas, advised her to stay alert, to stay away from the front of the demo, out of the line of fire, and to stay close to the more experienced activists. Finally, I told her I thought she would be all right. In fact, I think that may have been the last thing I said to her. Think you'll be all right. Shows that I know absolutely nothing. At 2:41 p.m. today, I called Hamid, her partner, and delivered the devastating news. We both sobbed and cried. What do you say to your friend whose wife was just murdered on a trip she took with you? What do you say when she traveled from Istanbul to Palestine with you, and yet you didn't go with her to the demonstration? What do you say when you have known for months that bringing a camera phone to face the U.S.-Israel genocidal machine is completely insufficient, and yet you traveled here with her anyway? To be honest, I thought injury, arrest, or death was likely for me. For some reason, I didn't think death would come to Aishenur. I was not prepared for this moment. It came so suddenly.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you have, thoughts reading that now, or if you want to continue sharing from other parts of that journey.
Yeah, I have. It's definitely hard reading it, and I also have some other entries from other points over the next couple of weeks after her murder that I could share.
Yeah, if you wanna share all of them, and then we can talk after. That works fine.
Cool. She was born in Turkey, but moved to the U.S., I think, before she was even 1 year old. So she grew up in the U.S., but her family made the decision to have her formal funeral in Turkey and have her buried in Turkey.
Mm.
And so I decided to travel there for the funeral.
Mm.
So this journal entry is from the funeral, September 14th, 2024. A few friends have caught glimpses of me standing off on my own. They acknowledge me with a subtle nod or a slight wave of the hand. A friend comes over and gives me a hug and whispers, "I'm sorry," in my ear. I don't think Hamid has seen me. After he and others fill her grave with dirt, he sits solemnly next to her for a very long time, just staring at the new mound of dirt dotted with flowers and draped in a keffiyeh and two small flags, one Turkish and one Palestinian. I don't notice any tears on his face. He appears dry-eyed. I am the same. The tears won't come in this moment. They feel stuck behind something. Perhaps if I was dead and had no more concerns swirling inside my brain, then this body would know how to cry. Instead, I retreat to a different part of the cemetery, too consumed with worry. Some time passes and everyone else has now left. I sit alone, waiting for the unknown time when this body will be at peace. Later, I approached Aishenur's grave, grateful to have an opportunity to finally get close and not have any cameras or dignitaries present. I touched the soil covering her body, and all I could think to say was, "I'm sorry," over and over again. As I did this, the tears finally started to flow. This was the moment I needed with her. The next morning, I visited Ayşenur's grave one more time before departing Didim for Istanbul. Hamid and his family were there, along with a few friends. I gave Hamid a stone from the spot in Beta where she fell when shot, and an olive from the tree she stood next to at the time of her murder. Finally, I brought a stone for him from the garden in Ramallah, where she had visited 2 nights before being killed. It is the place where some of us held a small memorial for her last week, and where we planted an olive tree in her honor. These mementos were suggested by another volunteer and friend, and I was glad to be able to deliver them to Hamid today. He was pleased and they seemed meaningful to him. And then, about a week later, I returned home from Turkey, and so I'll read a couple entries from that moment. 21st of September, 2024. I had a nightmare last night that I was fighting the Israeli military, and I was hiding from them down a steep hill. I was armed and planned to ambush them, or maybe just hide in the sagebrush out of sight until they passed. My objective was not clear. While I tried to figure that out in the dream, they found me. I could see them on the ledge above me, and I knew they had spotted me. For whatever reason, my gun and my bullets wouldn't reach them. It was only a matter of time before they shot me. It was such a helpless feeling. And in recalling the details, it was obvious that this dream was based on that day in Beta, when the Israeli forces stood on the high ground and easily picked off Aishenur from her compromised position in olive trees below. And then October 5th, 2024. The past 2 weeks have been a strange mix of feelings: sadness, despair, numbness, and confusion. Activities have mostly consisted of sleeping, meeting with friends to check in and process the murder, a few outdoor activities, and indulgent eating, likely as a way to escape the pain and the accompanying feelings of helplessness surrounding Aishenur's brutal death. One of the most jarring emotions that struck me for a few days was an intense rage. It was sparked by seeing a series of Palestine stickers, including one of Aishenur, defaced in the train station. Seeing her face scratched and colored over, ostensibly by local Zionists, sent me over the edge. The object of my anger became every single Zionist, but it also brought up thoughts of specific Washington state politicians. Not that any people were, but let's not be fooled by these people, these politicians, calling for an independent investigation into Aishenur's murder. Fuck them. A real investigation would find them guilty of her murder. Her blood is on their hands. I will spare the rest of you the sordid details of my vengeful fantasies. Friends have asked how I dealt with such overwhelming emotions. Unfiltered writing helped. Venting to a few people helped. I even had the chance to do some body-based therapy techniques to help release some of my rage. All of these have eased the burning feeling inside. And yet there is still a part of me that wonders if the rage is not the most useful of all the feelings that can arise in the grieving process. Of course, it can easily become directed at those who don't deserve it, and that is certainly a mistake. But if it can be honed and precisely targeted at the true enemies, can it not be the motivation some of us need to overcome our instincts towards self-preservation? This inability to direct our anger at the correct target seems to be one of the fatal flaws of those who espouse a revolutionary commitment. The frequency with which movements and projects are ripped apart by interpersonal conflicts and harms, often the result of misplaced rage, is well known and has likely been experienced by each and every one of us. This is one of the potential pitfalls of grief. In our inability to make sense of heinous domination and abuse, and in our feeling of helplessness to stop it or even hold the offending parties responsible, we look for other explanations or people to blame. So, may our rage burn bright until total liberation, and may it be directed at our true enemies and not at each other. Later in the week, I started the ongoing process of constructing a small altar in my apartment in honor of Aishenur. I burned candles and incense. In front of a large version of her martyr poster, I placed a river rock, and a rock from the seashore with a small seashell perched on top of it, from the river to the sea. In between the rocks, I sat a small tea saucer, on which I emptied a container of soil from the land of Palestine, a few dried olive leaves from Al-Quds, and a dusty rock from her grave in Didim, Turkey. Next to these items, I placed a framed, stylized Philistine placard written in Arabic calligraphy. The most recent addition to the altar is an old wooden slingshot symbolizing the remarkable and everlasting resistance of the Palestinians. Each morning, I spend a few minutes looking at Aishenur's face amidst this memorial in process, contemplating what has happened. On occasion, a few tears drip from my eyelids and slide down my cheek. Sometimes a groan of agony, sometimes a shake of the head. I do not feel weak when my mourning bubbles to the surface. I only feel weak that my tears don't translate to effective and decisive action. These are the twists and turns that my grief takes. Undoubtedly, I have not reached the end of this windy road. For now, all I can say is that life is composed of dying and mourning. Yet still, we must honor our martyrs. We must destroy what destroys us, what destroys the people of Palestine. We must globalize the Intifada.
Thank you so much for sharing. These are really powerful words, and I think your questions about the relationship between grief and anger and the instinct towards self-preservation and revolutionary commitment are really, really important for people to contemplate. Yeah, really appreciate you being so open. Before we go into further questions, do you have any other reflections on reading that now? And now that I guess just a few months have passed and you've probably shared this story with others before, I'm just curious.
I think it's been really unclear to me, like what to do, how to honor her, how to remember her, how to give a report back since I've returned. And so the best thing I can come up with to share are these journal entries because they just seem like the most honest words. And yet, I mean, I shared them when I initially sent them out to my, small group of friends. I've shared them in one other setting since then, but other than that, this is only the second time like reading them out loud. And I guess it's uncomfortable both because of the memories and like the first time I read them, I was like sobbing the whole time. Today I'm a little more composed, but I also found myself while reading them like wondering if it was too intimate and like questioning whether I should be sharing these things, especially because they mention other people. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm wrestling with right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes these conversations around the political can avoid the emotional experiences underlying a lot of political decisions or actions that people are taking. And it's not something that we're used to talking about, as you're saying, especially like publicly. So yeah, of course you should do what feels comfortable, but for what it's worth, I think this is extremely nourishing input to have in our conversations around this. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. It's helpful.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk again about ISM. Many people come into nonviolent accompaniment work like the kind that ISM does because they believe in nonviolence as a strategy of resistance to displacement, or because they're committed to the ideology of nonviolence, as you pointed out that distinction earlier, as resistance to displacement or to colonization or to war. And you mentioned earlier that your reason for joining ISM was slightly different, right? It was about being exposed to kind of the intensity of violence on the ground, right? And I'm wondering how this experience impacted your understanding of the role of accompaniment, if at all. Maybe it didn't change. And I guess kind of building off of that, what is your analysis of the work that ISM does, if you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah. I mean, I first want to say, like, I have no idea if my analyses are on the right track or even close to being correct. There's plenty of people who've done Palestine solidarity work for much longer than me and have much more experience. And I will say that the people I met in ISM are some of the bravest and most dedicated people I've ever met. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect for them as individuals and for the organization and what they're trying to do. Also, as I mentioned before, like, I actually didn't do the on the ground work with ISM. I only had the training. And then the next day, Aishiner was murdered. And then the rest of my few days there were spent attending memorials.
Mm.
And so there are many ISM volunteers who have personal accounts and anecdotes that their presence made a tangible difference in saving lives in specific situations. And so I can't discount that, like that those experiences are real. If I'm to look at it more broadly, though, it does seem that this sort of model of accompaniment or protective presence kind of tends to devolve into like a service-oriented framework.
What do you mean by service oriented?
Instead of like collectively planning strategic acts of resistance, it becomes more of like, let's call the ISM volunteers, like the select number of Palestinians who live in certain areas of the West Bank that have connections with ISM can be like, well, let's call them if we feel like we're under threat from Israeli military or settlers. So it's sort of this like crisis response model rather than like a long-term strategy of resistance. And that's not to say that it's not important to do that stuff. But I think if we're to step back and assess whether it's overall effective in like countering this like Zionist terror, I don't know that it is. I also think like the amount of violence and repression from the Israeli state makes a commitment to nonviolence at times seem illogical. So like one of the things I always say is like there's this common phrase, like you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, but like with this sort of model, you're not even like you're only bringing a camera phone to face off against these, very highly armed, violent forces. And it doesn't seem sufficient. So those would be sort of my thoughts on like the broader strategy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So what sort of resistance strategy do you think would be effective? And what sort of international solidarity do you think is useful in Palestine specifically, but also, I guess, in any anti-colonial struggle?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the context of Palestine, like it seems clear that Israel is not going to stop their settler colonial project and all the brutality that comes along with that unless the U.S. no longer backs them, in militarily, economically, diplomatically, etc. So I guess that points to the broader idea that an alternative is to say you live in the U.S. rather than going to do protective presence in Palestine, to stay in the U.S. and try to, frankly, destroy U.S. empire from inside. I mean, there was an essay released shortly after October 7th, 2023, and its conclusion, it was about what is like Palestine solidarity look like in the U.S., and the conclusion was pretty simple, that like solidarity with Palestine means destroying the United States. I think that's generally right. It's a project of empire, but how to do that becomes much more difficult question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my next question to you.
Yeah. I think it's pretty unclear. Like I think in general as a movement, there's not a clear direction. From what I can tell, sort of the most inspiring things are direct action campaigns of sabotage and property destruction. Those seem like the most tangible acts of solidarity that I've seen. So specifically, Palestine Action's campaign of targeting Elbit Systems, which is the largest or one of Israel's largest weapons manufacturers. And then, I think there's been other small direct actions that are designed to limit the material support from the state of Israel. And I'm certainly not the most knowledgeable on this, but from what I'm aware of, Palestine Actions is the one that has had like a sustained campaign with some victories, in terms of like shutting down factories and offices for this arms manufacturer. And I think a lot of those victories have come in the UK, although there has been activities on the east coast of the US as well.
Right. Yeah, so you just talked about logical forms of resistance in the US. Being in Palestine and going through this intense experience, are you walking away from that with an understanding of what Palestinian resistance can or should look like? Of course, you're not the authority on that, but after this experience, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how Palestinian resistance is often talked about or portrayed in Western media, and maybe how that contrasts with what you felt or what you found or what you learned after you went there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously sort of the imperialist position of Western media that any sort of armed struggle is like illegitimate or barbaric or something is nonsense. So I guess I don't have a need to go into that a lot, but I do think that just a basic understanding of the history of Palestine and how popular movements that were not armed or not primarily armed, have been like systematically crushed and defeated militarily, but also through sham negotiations like the Oslo Accords and stuff like that. Then I think if you just have like a pretty basic understanding of that history, and then on top of that, seeing the extreme level of violence that Palestinians face on a daily basis, it's pretty hard to argue that any form of resistance makes more sense than taking up arms. And, I think the counter argument is that, like, well, the Israeli military so advanced, it gets all this support from the US military. There's no way that like a guerrilla struggle can defeat this military. And maybe that's true. And I'm certainly no expert on armed struggle. I really don't know hardly anything, but I do think there are kind of counter arguments to that logic. So the piece that I'm going to mention is not exactly about that, but it gets into some of like the strategy of armed struggle in the context of Palestine. And that's this essay, but it was also like a video essay. It was both a written essay and a video essay called The Gaza Ghetto Uprising that maybe you can link to in the show notes or something, because I think that gets into a lot more of the details of why armed struggle makes sense in the context of Palestine. And yeah, despite the sort of like tremendous difference in power between the Israeli military and the Palestinian armed resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's definitely worth including that. I think I was also wanting to hear your point around the struggle around supporting, like the axis of resistance, for example. You have like multiple groups that are organized, armed groups fighting the Israeli military, but that hold statist or capitalist or certainly not leftist or progressive and certainly not anarchist values. And
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting nuance that doesn't necessarily have an answer, but something that we had talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you wanted to weigh in on that at all, or maybe talk a little bit more about that nuance.
Yeah, I'll try. I think there's kind of for most of my life, the visible Palestine solidarity movement in the U.S. has taken a very almost pacifist, sort of liberal approach, at least publicly, in that like nobody used to talk about supporting Hamas, or like there almost wasn't even an acknowledgement that like armed struggle existed. It was just like Palestinians were only victims, and so, we had to like feel bad for them. That, I think, has changed in the past year, 16 months or however long it's been, in that there is now a sizable chunk of the solidarity movement, which takes what I could broadly call them like the decolonial left, which is like Hamas and the other armed factions in the Palestinian resistance, along with the broader axis of resistance in the region, are kind of the vanguard of anti-colonial struggle. And so they need to be like uncritically supported. To be in solidarity with Palestine is to support these groups and these political parties without question. And I find that a little problematic as well. But as soon as you say that, there's really, from what I can tell, there's really not space to say that, because it's automatically assumed that you have some ideological aversion to violence, right, as a form of struggle. But that's not where I'm coming from. Personally, like I said in my previous answer, I think the only thing that really makes sense in the context of a place like Palestine is armed struggle. My objection to Hamas, which I'm not a scholar of Hamas. I only know what they've said publicly that's readily available. But from what I can tell, their political vision has nothing to do with abolishing capitalism or like a centralized state authority. And so it's hard to align my political values with that sort of vision. The objection is not that they have taken up armed struggle, And I also think it's also true that it's very hard to get accurate information about the Palestinian resistance factions in the US. There's a lot of obviously pro-Zionist propaganda that its entire purpose is to discredit Palestinian resistance. So I think all those things should be acknowledged, and also there should be a really honest debate amongst revolutionaries about what is the political vision of these organizations that are considered the leaders of anti-colonial struggles. And I think we should also look at it from a historical perspective of like, there's usually in anti-colonial struggles of the past a variety of political orientations and visions involved in the struggle, but almost always, if not always, sort of like bourgeois and authoritarian or semi-authoritarian faction wins out, right? So once independence is gained, then there's a new, some faction that was involved in the struggle becomes the ruling party, takes state power, and just recreates a new class society that continues to be miserable for the majority of people. So, like, if that's the result, I think we have to approach anti-colonial struggle with that knowledge and with a critical lens and a vision for something different than that, something that an anti-capitalist future, an anti-statist future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not asking you to answer this question exactly, but maybe this is a rhetorical question then, but how does one create an armed anti-colonial struggle that doesn't lead to a new state or a new capitalist regime in replacement of the colonizer? Yeah, it's it's a big question, I guess.
I have no idea. I don't know.
And I think your point around how there isn't a lot of space for nuance, because people often do assume that you're asking that question with an ideological goal, right? Because that question does very easily lead to the conclusion that any kind of armed struggle is statist, right? You end up sort of coming back to a weirdly pacifist platform, which is not. I don't think that's actually the ideology of the people that are making that point. But it's really tricky not to fall into that or not to be read that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, and I mean, I think there's also more to be said there. You're asking, does it actually work? Is it actually effective? And you mentioned the Gaza Ghetto Uprising, which is a great video essay everyone should check out. But I think seeing the ceasefire maybe shed some light on that, right? Is that like, guerrilla groups can have no impact or are ultimately powerless in the face of these giant, often like Western military superpowers. And I think we just saw from the ceasefire yesterday that that's not the case. But that's another show entirely. We'll have to do an interview with the Gaza military analyst at some point.
Yeah.
So another question that I wanted to ask you was a question that I think you actually recommended when I tried to have a conversation with you about how we might best have this conversation.
Okay.
And it was pretty simple. It's just, how did this experience change you?
Yeah. I think, as I mentioned it in the journal excerpts that I read. I did contemplate death a lot prior to going, but this experience of losing a friend in such an abrupt way has, I guess, just increased the amount that I think about my own death and the death of people close to me. I think, the fact that I overlooked the possibility of the deaths of my friends and comrades, that really hit me hard. And I think for me, and maybe for many of us, like, our own deaths are more acceptable than the deaths of our friends, family members, or loved ones. And I think, like, the governments and ruling classes will, like, take advantage of that. They do take advantage of that. I've had friends in Palestine talk about how there's many activists in the popular resistance who've spent many I'd had a lot of time in prison, been arrested many times, spent years in prison. And it doesn't stop them. It doesn't deter them from their organizing activities. But when the Israeli authorities threaten to kill their children or their partners or their family members, then that has a completely different effect. And it can really demobilize these really dedicated people.
Mm.
And I don't think that's unique to Palestine. Like, I think that's something that exists for a lot of us. And so it's really something we'll have to grapple with going forward. I think I've been pretty lost and floundering since I returned. I find it hard to feel like there's any activity worth doing. And so kind of like for lack of knowing what else to do, I've resorted to carrying around like physical memories of Aishenur and then just passing them out to whoever is interested, whoever will listen.
Mm.
You know, politically, it's a pretty useless activity, but I think it gives me something physically tangible to hold on to and to do, and makes me feel as if I'm like honoring her and remembering her in some small way.
Mm. Thank you. So I'm also wondering about how you're feeling about the ceasefire announcement. What thoughts and emotions are coming up for you right now? And what do you see on the horizon for Palestine, and what do you want to see going forward?
Yeah, I don't feel like I have a great grasp on the ceasefire details, but in general, I feel mixed. So on the one hand, there's like widespread reports and videos, and I've seen some of them that friends have sent, of Palestinians celebrating the announcement of the ceasefire in both Gaza and the West Bank. Also, I should note that in the West Bank and videos that I saw, the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military was also like cracking down on these celebrations. So even like, you know, brief moments of relief and jubilation are like repressed.
Hmm. Hmm. What do you think that repression is about?
I think I don't know. I guess I don't know, but I think that there is sort of like there is something very, I don't know the word, like inhumane doesn't do it justice, but like inhumane in all areas about the state of Israel, and that like even like small moments of joy and relief are like policed, you know. And it makes me also think of like, you know, in Palestine there's a practice when people are murdered to like make martyr posters for them, and you see them up all over the place. You know, oftentimes kids, everybody, they're all over. And depending on where it is, like the Israeli soldiers will like take them down or like spray paint over them. So like in Beta, I went and visited a few days after Aishenur was killed. And there were 17 martyrs from Beta over the past 3 years, all from those Friday demonstrations. And they had they weren't posters, but they were their faces.
Mm.
Stencils of their faces were spray painted on the side of a building near where people pray every Friday. But the Israeli military had come and spray painted over every single one of them. And so it just reminds me that like even in death, like there's no dignity allowed. And that strikes me as somewhat similar to this of like, I mean, this is a momentary halt in a genocide, or maybe, and people are not even allowed to like breathe.
Mm.
So, I mean, the little bit that I know, it seems like there's sort of an unclear number of Palestinian prisoners are going to be released, or potentially there's some sort of like equation of like 30 to 50 Palestinian prisoners for every one Israeli hostage or something. I mean, that seems like that was a clear goal of the October 7th operation was to have people that they could exchange for prisoners to free, because there's, so many Palestinian prisoners. So, I mean, that's something to be celebrated. Certainly, a temporary reprieve from the bombing assaults in Gaza is good, but I also have a lot of trepidation around it. And even in the past 24 hours, there's been reports of at least 80 Palestinians killed in Gaza. And so it's like, what does a ceasefire mean when Israel can just ramp up its death machine in the hours leading up to the official start of the ceasefire? And in the West Bank, like, there's been airstrikes since announcement of the ceasefire deal, airstrikes in the Jenin refugee camp. And as of yesterday, there was at least 10 Palestinians there who've been martyred. And there's other Israeli military aggressions and increases of aggressions in the West Bank just in the past day. So it's hard to feel any sense of relief. And I think it's clear that even if there is this ceasefire, the state of Israel will not stop its reign of terror. And then even on like its recent record of breaching ceasefire agreements, we can't reasonably expect them to follow even the limited terms of this deal. And certainly, like, in the long run going forward, this doesn't seem to do anything to limit the longevity or strength of the Zionist project. I think, like, in the U.S. realm foreign policy, it's kind of another blow to Biden. It kind of demonstrates how uninterested Biden, Harris, and the Democrats have been in preserving even a small number of Palestinian lives in Gaza. I don't really understand, like, why the ceasefire is going through now, but it seems in the media the speculation that Trump has something to do with pushing for it. And it's just like it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Biden has a more genocidal and racist policy towards Palestinians than even a horrific figure like Trump. And so I think that Biden's administration will go down in history as a terribly genocidal, racist, and, like, callously inhumane. And then I think another way to look at it is, like, for people internationally who consider themselves in solidarity with Palestine, I think ceasefire should never be the primary demand. And I'm concerned that news of this quote-unquote deal will lead many, especially in the U.S., to think that, like, the issue's over, but the reality of the settler colonial project continues, and the U.S. support for Israel persists, and it will continue to make life in Palestine deadly and miserable. And I saw this editorial in Mondoweiss from yesterday, written by an author in Gaza, and I wondered if I could read an excerpt from it.
Yeah, please do.
The author's name is, and I apologize because I probably won't pronounce it correctly, but Ruah. First name is Roaa.
Mm-hmm.
Last name is Shamallakh.
Gotcha.
And the title of the editorial is called "The Gaza Ceasefire Will Not Cure the Wounds of Genocide." And so the writer says, for us, and I'm kind of like skipping around a little bit, but for us, the war began long before October 7th, 2023, and continues in the ashes of what was once our home. The world's ceasefire is a fabricated pause in our endless torment. The world seeks its own resolution, a quick fix to soothe the conscience, but for us, the ceasefire is just another fleeting moment in a long history of erasure. And then skipping forward a little bit. As the world celebrates the ceasefire, we are left to question its meaning. What does it truly signify for us in Gaza? It is not an end to the war. It is simply a temporary lull in the violence. It does not undo the devastation or does it heal the wounds inflicted on us? Ceasefire is nothing more than a global performance, signal that the world has done enough to appease its own conscience. But for us, it is nothing more than an intermission and an endless tragedy. When the bombs stop, the trauma does not fade. The streets still lie in ruins, the poisoned water still courses through our bodies, and the toxic memories of the bombings linger like an invisible disease. We don't return to normal. We adapt to a new kind of existence, one that is born from the wreckage of our past and the uncertainty of our future. Ceasefire does not undo the loss of homes, of lives, of family members. It does not bring back what has been destroyed. It does not restore dignity, nor does it heal the wounds of displacement. For the world, a ceasefire is the end of the story, the resolution that allows the audience to turn the page. But for us, it is just another silence, another chapter in a story that never truly ends. The bombs may stop, but the wounds they leave behind will continue to bleed. And the silence that follows is not peace. It is the deafening quiet of lives left in limbo, waiting for the next round of violence to begin.
It's interesting to reflect on this now. I'm thinking about of the parallel that I think there is between calls for a ceasefire and calls for divestment in the student movement, where ceasefire is, of course, something that we all want, right? Like, as I think you called it, like a temporary lull or a pause in a genocide. Of course, people don't want continued attacks, but there's a way in which calling for that kind of sets us up for forgetting the rest afterwards. And with divestment, I think in the student movement, that was a huge issue, is that people can rally behind divestment as a clear goal, calling on universities to divest. But then the goal is actually so much greater than divestment, and in many ways divestment, when it's achieved, is counterinsurgent, because so many universities actually use negotiations around divestment as a way to divert attention away from their support for Israel's genocide, and instead, I don't know. I was talking about this recently with a friend who was looking desperately for examples of ways that divestment negotiations have gone well. And the first thing they found was Rutgers University, I guess, established a new department for Middle Eastern studies or something as part of their negotiations package. But it was a diversion, basically, and they established a committee to think about the possibility of maybe at some point in the future pulling their money out of Israeli weapons. But it's interesting how those two things sort of function. Like, of course we want a ceasefire, of course we want divestment, but then once that's achieved, it's very easy to get lost or have your attention diverted and to think there's no longer a conflict, or there's no longer a need to continue fighting. And as I think you said, to globalize the intifada, right? So I think those are really important things for people to keep in mind. And thanks for sharing that clip.
Sure. That's a good parallel too. I hadn't made that connection. I think that's a good point. Do you have other thoughts on the ceasefire?
I think I also feel sort of conflicted around celebrating it. I think the first instinct where I am was to celebrate, and so we had a little celebration, but it was more. I think more than anything, we were wanting to be in community with other people that we feel aligned with, and just to share space with people. But there wasn't a sense of, oh, okay, great, the genocide is over and we can all go back to our regular lives, like, at all. And I think, yeah, it's a complicated situation. I think in ways it's really inspiring that clearly the Palestinian resistance was able to actually meet their goals on October 7th in resisting in some way Israeli occupation. But there's, of course, a huge difference between, a ceasefire and ending the occupation. And I think now I'm seeing this like it's almost like there's I don't know what to call that, like a sort of switch in discourse where calling for a ceasefire was always, it sort of became a rallying cry of like the sort of liberal left. And now people are like, well, yeah, there's a ceasefire, but we always wanted more than a ceasefire. And so it's sort of like you're sort of realizing like the failure of what calling for a ceasefire does. And so I can already see people even here at the local, student movement level being like, yeah, a ceasefire is good, but we want an end to the occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And making that really, really clear is important right now. But I also think it's important to celebrate, and like seeing that people in Palestine were celebrating, seeing that people in Gaza were celebrating, I think just proves that point, right? It's like we do need to be able to be with each other and to breathe and to appreciate a brief end to suffering in some way when it occurs. Not that all suffering is ending, but yeah, it's like how do you hold both, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, is there anything else that you want to share with listeners? This has been a pretty comprehensive discussion, but if there's any other points that you want to make, or questions that came up for you, or comments you want to share, the floor is yours.
I think I would just say, like, I think the struggle will continue in Palestine. A number of Palestinians will continue to resist in various ways. And kind of the burning question is whether people internationally will mount any sort of materially effective struggle to assist the liberation efforts there. I think like over the past 15, 16 months, there's been more numbers of people and more attention paid to Palestine than ever before, at least in the U.S. in my experience. But it didn't have, it wasn't nearly enough in terms of like having a material effect. And so I think that so far the answer has been no. And as courageous and steadfast as Palestinians are in their resistance, like it seems that it will take a significant shift from a large number of people outside of Palestine who are willing to fight too.
Yeah. And I think that's also come up in our conversation earlier, I think. But you're saying you feel like the only way this is going to move forward is with international solidarity in Palestine?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that there's nothing people can do in their own countries outside of Palestine, but I think it needs to be significantly more risky than what the majority of people have been willing to do so far.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of like what would like an international armed struggle look like, I mean, like I said, I really am no expert on it. I don't know how it would come about. I mean, I'm also limited in my knowledge of this, but I think the model of like international volunteers who went to Rojava to fight alongside or be within the YPG and YPJ seems like a different model of international solidarity than what we've been talking about in Palestine. But whether I think a quick response that I would get is like, that's a totally different situation. And I think that's true. It is a different situation. So I have no idea if that sort of thing is even feasible in Palestine.
Yeah, it also, it harkens back to the Spanish Civil War as well. And like the internationals who came to fight against fascists there. Like there is a history and a context for that sort of solidarity, but of course it's different on the ground in each time and place.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting to me that you would have this experience doing accompaniment work and then come away with that kind of analysis. I think it's worth reflecting on.
Yeah.
But yeah, is there anything else that you want to share? Otherwise, I think we can end it here.
I guess just to re-emphasize that my critical perspectives on the overall strategy of groups like the ISM could very well be wrong, and also are not meant in any way as like personal critiques or attacks. Like I said, I think I have great respect for people who have done and continue to do that work. The way forward is not clear. I'm certainly not offering any clear answers. So I mean no disrespect.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk about something so important and so intense, and for sharing so much about your own personal experience. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I'm excited to share it.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.